Hey everybody, it is Dak here from the Ed Boys, and welcome to my OSRS Gauntlet guide. The Gauntlet is a combat challenge brought to you by the Elves of Privdinus. Unlike other PvM content in OSRS, you don't bring any gear or items in with you. Similar to Dungeoneering in RS3, you need to make your own armor, weapons, and food while you're within the Gauntlet. Each run you're going to start with a few tools that'll help you gather your supplies. You only get 10 minutes to set up for the boss fight, and if the clock runs out, you're automatically teleported into the fight, so you've got to be quick. The boss fight is the Hunllef each time. The Hunllef is a powerful boss that requires many different PvM aspects to kill. It can be a challenging fight, but there's also some very solid rewards for the challenge. In this guide, I will start with the requirements and recommended stats for the Gauntlet. After that, we'll discuss the general mechanics for the Gauntlet pre-boss, so that's how to collect your armor, your weapons, your food, and your potions. Then I'll go over the actual boss mechanics, followed by a full example run to put it all together. The Gauntlet does have a corrupted version, which is a more challenging and rewarding version than the normal Gauntlet, and I'll be giving some tips on how to run the Corrupted Gauntlet before finally getting into the loot section of the guide. You need to complete the Song of the Elves quest to get into the Elven City and even try out the Gauntlet in the first place. This requires a handful of 70s in some non-combat stats, since it is a pretty high-level quest. As for your combat stats, I wouldn't take very much time on the Gauntlet with any less than 85 in each melee, range, and magic stats. You can get away with only 2 out of 3, but overall it's going to be a lot more convenient if you have high stats in all of them. Also, 85 is fairly minimal. I suggest taking the time to grind out 90 plus if you actually plan on doing a lot of Gauntlet kills, especially if you plan on doing the Corrupted Gauntlet. A high prayer level and having Piety, Rigor, and Augury unlocked is very helpful for getting some successful kills. Again, you could manage with 2 out of these 3 options, but Piety and Rigor are going to be the most important of the 2. You do need to fish, woodcut, mine, and cook in the Gauntlet, and having higher levels on all of these stats can make a difference in your setup times, so it is not required to have high levels in these stats, but the higher the better for your Gauntlet times overall. At this point in the guide, I would normally go over what gear to wear and what to bring in your inventory, then how to travel to the boss and bank and whatnot, but conveniently, you don't have to go through any of that setup for the Gauntlet. You don't have to bring any of your stuff with you, and there is a deposit box for loot right outside the entrance, so banking and travel doesn't really matter. I am a big fan of how easy it is to sit down and knock out some Gauntlet attempts compared to any other bossing counterparts. You don't have to reset your inventory at all for whatever activity you were doing previously. You can just show up, throw down some gauntlets, and then go back to whatever you were doing. Just because you don't need to set up for the Gauntlet kill at your bank doesn't mean that there isn't any setup for this boss fight at all. In fact, each kill involves 2 different parts. You have the setup and then the boss fight, and we're going to start with talking about how to set up. All of the things that you need can be gathered around the dungeon. You'll notice that you get crystal shards from just about any activity. Crystal shards are used to make just about anything at the singing bowl in the first room. This includes your weapons, your armor, your vials for potions, things like that. One thing that you need to get used to is knowing how many crystal shards you need for whatever armor, weapons, and potions that you have left. If you need more shards, tier 2 monsters like unicorns, scorpions, and wolves tend to drop the most, even more than the demi-bosses. First, let's talk about this crystal teleport seed. You are given one of these at the beginning of the dungeon. Monsters can drop a teleport seed, and you can make one for 40 crystal shards at the singing bowl. These seeds can save you a ton of time, and in many cases can be a lifesaver when it comes to setting up before you get teleported into the boss. You'll rarely need to make more than 1 extra seed, and in many cases you can get away with only the 1 seed that you're given when you start. It is important to make sure that anytime that you're running away from home base, though, you have a crystal teleport seed with you. Even if you plan on only going a room or 2 away, it'll still save you a little bit of time, and sometimes you're going to find yourself running further from home than you expected, so if you have no seed and you're running out of time, that could be the end of the line for you. Let's talk about some weaponry. One of the items that you start with is a crystal scepter. This scepter is required to light up any of the rooms in the dungeon, but can also be used as a weak melee weapon to get you started. To get an actual weapon, you are going to need a weapon frame, which can be dropped by NPCs in the dungeon. For your very first weapon frame, you have a pretty guaranteed rate. If you've yet to get a weapon frame, then it is guaranteed that your 3rd kill on a tier 1 monster will drop a frame. It is also possible that kill 1 or 2 on a tier 1 monster drops a weapon frame, and if it does, then the 3rd one is no longer guaranteed to drop. Your first tier 2 monster that you kill, that's back to like the unicorns, the scorpions, the wolves, that's guaranteed to drop a weapon frame for you if you haven't gotten one already. And no matter how many weapon frames you've already received, the tier 3 monsters or the demi-bosses will always drop a weapon frame. Overall, it's not really suggested to kill a demi-boss with your scepter. It's going to be a very slow kill and take you too long. Usually you want to get a weapon upgrade first, but it's generally very easy to get a weapon frame in your first few rooms, so you don't have to worry about that too much. Remember that the guaranteed weapon frame drop from tier 1 and tier 2 monsters only happen for your first weapon frame. Once you've received a weapon frame from anything, then those aren't guaranteed drops anymore, but the demi-bosses will always have a 100% chance at dropping a weapon frame. Now that you have a weapon frame, you can make a good weapon out of it, and you have 3 choices, 1 for each attack style. Each the bow, the halberd, and the staff have 3 tiers to them. To make a tier 1 weapon, you need to take a weapon frame and 20 shards to the singing bowl back at the home room. To upgrade a tier 1 weapon to tier 2, you need to make a tier 1 weapon and add 60 more crystal shards to it. And for tier 3 weapons, you don't need any extra shards, but you do need a rare resource to upgrade. These rare resources can be obtained by killing a demi-boss, which I previously mentioned when discussing weapon frames. Demi-bosses can only spawn in these rooms among the outer ring of the dungeon. There are 12 rooms that can have a demi-boss, but only 6 of them will spawn total in each gauntlet run. The dragon drops a crystal orb, which can be used to make a tier 3 staff. The dark beast drops a bowstring, which can be used for the tier 3 bow. And the bear drops a spike, which can be used for the tier 3 halberd. If you kill multiple of the same demi-boss, then the second kill is not going to drop that same guaranteed resource. Rather, you're going to get one that you don't have yet. In other words, if you killed a dragon, then a dark beast, then another dragon, instead of getting a second orb on the second dragon, you're going to get a spike since you haven't received a spike yet. If you were to kill 2 dragons in a row, the first one will drop an orb. The second one, it's 50-50 whether or not it'll drop a spike or a bowstring. You're going to want to make at least 1 tier 3 weapon to fight the Hunllef boss, and in most cases, you're going to want 2 of them. The halberd is the strongest weapon. It's almost the exact same DPS as the bow, but since it is a melee weapon, it has an aggressive attack option, which gives it a higher max hit. The bow is still very strong, leaving the tier 3 staff being the weakest tier 3 option. The staff and the bow can be used from farther away than the halberd, though. The halberd has more attack range than your average melee weapon, but it's still easier to move around the boss fight while attacking the boss if you're using either the bow or staff. For this reason, it is suggested to use a tier 3 bow and staff while learning the gauntlet, and eventually going for the halberd instead of the staff to slightly speed up your runs once you feel more comfortable with the Hunllef kill. We'll discuss strategy a little bit more later, though. This is the part of the guide that's just talking about mechanics and how to gather items. Now we can move on to armor. Unlike weaponry, the armor isn't really important until the boss fight, so you don't have to make sure to get the armor before fighting any demi-bosses or anything like that. There are 3 different pieces of armor that you can make. There's a helmet, a chest plate, and some plate legs. The armor has no offensive boosts. They do have a solid prayer boost, and overall they reduce the max hits that you can take from the boss fights, so it's all about defense, no offense to it. To make crystal armor, you need to gather resources from the dungeon. Every piece of armor requires some friend bark, crystal ore, and linum terinum. Or in other words, you need wood, ores, and wool. These wood, ores, and wool can be gathered from around the dungeon. Each of these resource locations will give you 3 of their corresponding resource. You'll be given an axe and a pickaxe to chop your wood and mine your ore, and the wool can be picked with your hands, so there is no tool needed. Just like any of the other tools that you can receive at the start of the dungeon, you can get another one from the center of the room if you manage to lose yours. Each piece of armor has 3 tiers, very similar to weapons. Keep in mind when looking at this chart, you always need the same amount of wood, ore, and wool to make a piece of armor. It's not that you just need 1 of either of those pieces. When I put a 1 or a 2 next to those, that means you need 1 or 2 of each of those resources to build that piece of armor. To make any tier 1 piece of armor, you're going to need 1 wood, 1 ore, and 1 wool, and then 40 crystal shards. That means for a full set of tier 1 armor, you need 3 of each resource and 120 crystal shards. Each resource location, the trees, the mining spot, and the wool provides 3 of their resource, so to make just 1 set of tier 1 armor, you only need to find 1 of each of these spots. For your tier 2 armor, you need to first make each tier 1 piece, just like any other gear that you'd be upgrading in the dungeon. For the helmet and plate legs, you only need 1 extra wood, ore, and wool to upgrade to tier 2, but for the tier 2 chest plate, that alone requires 2 of each resource. Also, each tier 2 piece of armor requires 60 more shards. This means for full tier 2 armor from scratch, you're going to need 7 wood, 7 ores, 7 wool, and 300 crystal shards. That 7th of each resource means that you need to find a 3rd resource spot, so it's often a better idea just to stick to tier 1 on the helm or the legs if you don't really like them. Make a tier 2 chest and not have to go for the 7th resource, just survive off of 6. You'll still end up with a couple of tier 2 pieces of armor, so it's going to be better than just going for tier 1, and it could save you some time if you're having trouble setting up in time for the boss fight. Each piece of tier 3 armor requires another 2 resources and 80 crystals per piece, which is going to take a lot of extra time to make. Overall, you could go for 3 resource locations, getting 9 wood, 9 ore, and 9 wool. That way you can make 1 piece of tier 3 armor and then 2 pieces of tier 2 armor. This is a little overkill unless you're having a lot of trouble with that boss fight. If you have plenty of time left over on your setup and you're having trouble killing the boss, then you could afford to go for some tier 3 armor. But in the long run, your goal is really to be more down to that tier 1 armor. Now that you have weapons and armor, you still need some food and potions just like any other boss run. Let's go ahead and start with the food. Paddlefish can be fished with a harpoon from fishing spots around the dungeon. Each fishing spot yields 4 raw paddlefish. Some rooms are only going to have 1 fishing spot, but occasionally you can find a room with 3 or 4 spots in it, which is very convenient. You can also get raw paddlefish as a drop from monsters occasionally. The higher tier monsters drop more fish. Obviously, the amount of fish that you're going to need depends on your levels, the gear that you're going with, and how good you are at the boss overall. So while you're learning how to do the gauntlet, I would suggest getting a lot of fish, like 16 to 20 plus. And if you find that that's way more fish than you need, that's a pretty good sign. You can save a lot of setup time. Apparently, you're doing well in the boss if you're not using that much food. Fish will solve the problem of healing up, but you're also going to be using prayer and running around a lot. So, luckily in the gauntlet we have the Eggnog Potion. This potion acts as both a stamina and a prayer pot. To make this, you need a Grim Leaf and Crystal Dust. The Grim Leaf can be picked from resource locations around the dungeon, but also can be dropped by monsters. The Crystal Dust is made by using a pestle and mortar on some crystal shards, 10 at a time. One 3-dose potion requires 10 crystal dust, or in other words, 10 crystal shards. These potions can be helpful during setup, especially if you're running around a lot, but overall they're mostly just needed for the boss fight, so it can be one of the last things you finish off. So in each setup, in each gauntlet run, you're going to need to go through collecting all of this stuff. How much you need to collect depends on your stats and how good you are at the Hunllef fight. For your weapons, I would go with 2 tier 3 weapons, either the bow and staff for beginners, or the bow and the halberd for more experienced players. There is a 5-to-1 method that can require a 3rd weapon, but I will discuss that a little bit later. For 2 tier 3 weapons, you're going to need 2 weapon frames, 160 crystal shards, and the rare resources that correspond to whatever weapon you decide to make. For your armor, I would start with getting 6 of each resource, making a tier 2 plate, tier 2 legs, and a tier 1 helmet. This means you need to find 2 of each resource location around the dungeon and another 240 crystal shards. If you're having trouble surviving the Hunllef boss, then you might want to go for higher tier armor. In the long run, the goal is to only be going for all tier 1 armor, so you only need to find 1 of each resource location. But your armor does reduce the damage that you're taking in the Hunllef fight, so if you're just barely not getting the kill, slightly stronger armor will be the call. As I said before, I would go for like 16 to 20 fish for your first fight or 2, and then just go from there. If you're killing the Hunllef and you got a lot of food left over, then go for less food. But if you're dying and you're not bringing a full envy, then maybe more food is the way to go to get yourself through the fight. For the Eggnog Potions, 2 of them really is the sweet spot. You might need a 3rd potion if you used a dose during your setup portion of the dungeon, but 2 3-dose potions should be fine for the fight. This would require 2 Grim Herbs, 40 crystal shards, that's 20 for the vials, and 20 for the potions. For the full setup, we've got 2 weapon frames, 6 wood, 6 ores, 6 wool, 16 to 20 paddlefish, 2 Grim Herbs, and 440 crystal shards. Plus, if you end up making another crystal teleport, then this is going to cost you another 40 crystal shards. These numbers will change as you find you need less equipment and less food to kill the Hunllef, but they're decent numbers to keep in mind as you get started. If you still have any questions about setting up for the Hunllef fight, be sure to leave them in the comments section below. I'm about to discuss the actual mechanics for fighting the Hunllef, but I will also go over an actual example kill of collecting supplies and whatnot after this full-on mechanics section here. So there will be more discussion about setting up for the Hunllef fight in a little bit. Now let's talk about the boss fight mechanics. The Hunllef is a powerful boss which requires players to use a few different mechanics to win the fight, including some prayer switches, weapon switches, and moving your feet around a lot. First, the weapon switches. You're going to notice that the Hunllef uses overhead prayers. She'll start with a random prayer on, and every 6 attacks that you do to her that she doesn't protect from, she'll switch her overhead. Generally, the strategy is to use 6 range hits, then 6 mage hits, and repeat, or obviously melee hits instead of mage if you're using the halberd. There is a 5-to-1 strategy that comes in here too. She's only going to switch her overhead to whatever attack you use on that 6th attack. So you could potentially use 5 attacks with whatever your best attack style is, then a bad attack from a different style to switch her overheads. You do need to be able to use all 3 attack styles for this method, but if you're using a crystal bow as your good weapon, you can bring a staff to switch her over to protect from magic, and you can just unequip your weapon to kick or punch her to turn her on to protect from melee. 5-to-1 is a little bit more efficient for killing the Hunllef quickly. If you mess up your 5-to-1 though, you're going to be stuck using a weak weapon for 6 attacks, so doing 5-to-1 poorly is going to slow you down more than it's going to help. Obviously, I don't suggest trying 5-to-1 while learning the Hunllef fight, so just remember every 6 attacks you're going to be switching between your 2 weapons. If you lose count, it doesn't really matter since it is pretty easy to notice the overhead prayer change on the Hunllef, but it is important to notice that too. The more time you spend using attacks that she's protecting from, the more likely you're going to end up running out of food and dying. The Hunllef can use both ranged and magic, but they are pretty easy to protect from. She's going to switch between range and mage every 4 attacks, and every fight she's going to be starting with range. It can help to keep count of these 4 attacks, but she has a pretty obvious animation when she's changing attack style. Both of them do damage if you are praying correctly, but it's a lot less than she would have hit if your prayers were off. Higher tier armor does reduce the max hit of her attacks, even the ones that hit through prayer. So if you're having trouble with the fight, higher tier armor might save you a little bit. When she is currently using magic, only her magic attack, not while she's during her range phase, she has an attack that looks a little bit different than the regular magic attack. This one's going to turn off your prayers similar to Vorkath's Purple Dragon Breath. It is pretty easy to spot the attack and get your prayers back on for the next hit, but if you're dealing with a few other things at the same time, it can be a little bit tricky, so be aware of this attack. The Hunllef has a special attack that will summon a few tornadoes somewhat near the corners of the room. These tornadoes will follow the player around for a bit, and if they catch up to you, they can deal a lot of damage. The amount of tornadoes that spawn depends on how far into the fight you are. The more damage that you've done to the Hunllef, the more tornadoes that will spawn. Higher tier armor also lowers the max hit from these tornadoes, so that is another reason to get some solid armor if you're having trouble finishing the kill. When she uses this tornado attack, it does count as one of her 4 attacks before she switches attack styles. During the entire fight, the floor is going to keep changing patterns, occasionally making a chunk of the tiles dangerous. You get a small warning where the tiles are a blue or a red color if you're in the Corrupted Gauntlet before they turn orange and dangerous. The further you get into the fight, the shorter that warning is, and the floor is going to change patterns more often with more complicated areas to run around in. This mechanic isn't that troublesome until the tornadoes are summoned. Late in the fight, you're going to have a lot of tornadoes chasing you, and the floor is changing pretty rapidly. This often is where most players get knocked out, especially if the Hunllef turns off your prayer while you're busy with your footwork, so it can be a lot to think about at once. Another part of the fight that can make running around difficult is the fact that the Hunllef can trample you if you step under her, similar to the Corporal Beast. If you're running around trying to dodge the danger tiles in the Stalker Tornadoes, you gotta make sure not to walk under the Hunllef while you're doing it, or you could take some big damage. If she does stomp you, keep in mind that her stomp does not count towards one of her 4 attacks before she switches attack styles. There is a lot to remember while fighting the Hunllef, but most of it comes down to the same concept that you're going to need in any other bossing life, and that is practice makes perfect. Actually trying out the fight and going in there and practicing it is the best way to get better at it. Those are all the mechanics for both the setup and the boss phase. If you have any more questions on just how something in the Gauntlet works, be sure to let me know in the comments section below, and I can get back to you as soon as possible. Now that you know how everything works in the Gauntlet, it's time to move on to a typical full run. I'll go over my general strategy for setting up, which is mostly going to involve just looking at the map and talking about it, but sometimes your setup is also going to depend on your RNG and what spawns in each room. Because of this, you might be looking for more examples than just like one dungeon, and I am going to be making an hour of Gauntlet and an hour of Corrupted Gauntlet video to give you those examples. Once those videos are released, they will be linked in the description. Starting off at the home base, it is not a bad idea to drop off your pestle and mortar since you don't need it anywhere else in the dungeon, and it gives you an extra inv space for getting some supplies. You will have to come back to the base at least one time before you have all of your supplies, unless you plan on killing a demi-boss without your scepter, or fighting the Hunllef without a tier 3 weapon, but neither of those are a very good idea. Your first trip out, you want to stay pretty close to the base, but there are a few demi-boss rooms that are pretty close to home base with you, so you can check out some of the rooms between the base and those possible demi-bosses, while also checking on those demi-boss rooms before you go back to make a good weapon. Here's the order that I generally go from the starting room. Not every starting room is going to be north of the boss, but the same pattern applies no matter which side of the boss you start on. Instead of heading right at the demi-bosses on the edge of the room, I first branch out one room to the side, collecting any supplies in that room. I usually check at least one more room in that direction just to see if there's any supplies in there that I need. If there is, I'll go ahead and get them, but either way, the next room that I'm going for is actually headed towards the demi-bosses. In these first few rooms, you usually have gotten a weapon frame, but even if you didn't, you've likely gotten some of your armor supplies and maybe some food and herbs. After grabbing supplies from this third explored room, I then check room 4 to see if there's a demi-boss, but I don't plan on killing it yet. If it is a demi-boss that I need to get a resource from, then I'll come back with a better weapon soon. I move on to room 5 and then check room 6 the same way that I checked room 4. At this point, I've usually got enough stuff and a weapon frame to head back to the base. If you haven't found a weapon frame yet though, you want to keep checking a few other rooms nearby until you get one. It does help to stay close to the base so that you don't have to use your teleport to get back. At the base, you need to make a weapon, and if you use a teleport seed, be sure to make another one. If you have any spare crystal shards and enough supplies to make your armor, you might as well make some of the pieces now, or maybe all of it if you have a lot of shards. If not though, drop whatever wood, ores, and wool that you have left over right at the singing bowl for later. There's no point in taking it out with you unless you feel like you have enough NV spaces to go get the rest of your supplies anyway. Technically, it does take longer to drop your stuff and then pick it up later, so if you don't need the extra NV space, you don't have to drop anything on the ground. For your second trip out, your main goal should be to finish your tier 3 weapons, but you also probably gotta make a judgment call depending on what you found in the dungeon so far. You'll likely still need some fish or to be looking for a resource to make some armor. If you found a demi-boss of your liking in those first 2 demi-boss rooms, rooms 4 and 6 that you peeked in, head back to there and kill them first. Don't forget to grab a second weapon frame too, or a third one if you plan on making all 3 weapons. If there wasn't a good demi-boss in that original direction that you went in, then head somewhere to the other demi-bosses and search for those resources. The exact direction that you go for your second trip is really not a big deal, as you are most likely using a seed to teleport back no matter what. So you could even travel to the edges of the dungeon just finding the rest of the stuff that you need. Once you've gotten your tier 3 weapon resources and you can finish whatever armor, food, and potions you need, teleport back to the base. Make all of your armor, weapons, and a couple of vials at the singing bowl. The vials can be filled with water by the range, which is on the opposite side of the home room from the singing bowl. Cook your food on that range, and then you should be good to go. Usually the checklist that I'm going over in my head before going into the fight is just weapons, armor, food, 2 potions. Weapons, armor, food, 2 potions. If you've got all that stuff, you're ready to fight. To speed up your setup time, it mostly just takes practice, doing it over and over again, having memorized what items you need each run, and then never forgetting your crystal teleport seeds. You're never going to have to worry about running out of 10 minutes in the normal gauntlet, and in the 7.5 minutes that you get for Corrupted, you're usually pretty good to go, but you might end up going for lower tier armor and less food to save time. That's all part of the challenge of the Corrupted Gauntlet, though, is you don't get enough time for high-level gear and a lot of food before you have to fight an even stronger monster. Let's go ahead and get into that fight. I've already discussed the mechanics of how the fight actually works, and the Corrupted Gauntlet has the same mechanics as that regular one, but the max hits are increased, the health is increased, and the amount of tornadoes that it spawns is also increased. The overall tips and tricks to the fight work out the same way, so I'll be going over this section of the guide kind of as Corrupted Hunllef tips, but even if you're only trying to kill the regular Hunllef, these strategies are still going to work out the same. The one difference is if you mess up these strategies in the Corrupted Gauntlet, you do get punished a lot harder. When the Hunllef is using a range attack, you don't really have that much to focus on, but when she starts using magic, she can turn off your prayers at any time. I highly suggest keeping your prayer tab open and just using your F keys to quickly go to the inventory occasionally when you need to switch your weapons or eat. If you're quick with your F keys and you know where your prayers are, then you do have enough time to just react to the prayer disabling attack. But if you're learning the Hunllef fight, or even just late in the fight if you're a pro, things can get a little bit hectic, and you might be late on turning those prayers back on if you are focused on other things. Even though the Hunllef has an animation to show you that she is switching attack styles, I suggest to keep count of her attacks as much as you can so you don't always have to rely on that. When there's not much going on, it is pretty easy to react to the animation and switch your prayers. But for one, if you already know when the attack is happening, you can switch your prayer before you even see the animation, giving yourself more time to do things like run. But also, if you're in the process of running away from some tornadoes and you're watching the floor, it's very possible you're going to miss that animation when she switches attack styles. Even if you just see the animation late, you might not switch to your prayers in time. Pretty much 90% of the time that you die, it's going to come down to you trying to run away from the tornadoes while the floors are changing very quickly towards the end of the fight. There is a lot of strategy for running around in certain areas with certain floor patterns at certain times of the fight, but rather than remembering all of the best spots to go back and forth during the floor patterns, I personally felt better off just being a little bit better with moving my feet. Obviously, saying just being good is just as helpful as saying practice will make you get better, but it is true. Practicing your movement and your character can be very important here, similar to trying to Wooks Walk Vorkath or soloing Olm and running his head. Remember that while your character is running, they move 2 squares per tick, so if you click only 2 squares away or less, you have to click somewhere else on the very next tick, or your character is going to stop moving for a second. Turning off your run will make you move 1 square at a time, which makes it a lot easier to visually see where you're standing and how long you have until you stop moving, but it also gives you less time to move off of those dangerous floor tiles when they change, so I personally suggest keeping your run energy on. The Wook's Walk is a somewhat viable method here, since the tornadoes do work similarly to Vorkath's Fire Barrage attack. This can only be done when using a melee weapon, since you do need to click out of your weapon's attack range between attacks. Using a Wook's Walk method to dodge the tornadoes will sometimes be more efficient for getting more damage in, but it also requires very little space to be able to dodge the tornadoes. So even if you're not attacking, you can potentially just click between 2 spaces, 1 click on every tick, and you wouldn't be damaged by the tornadoes. You'll just walk back and forth until it is over. The biggest problem with the Wook's Walking the tornadoes, though, is if the Hunllef changes its attack style or just straight up turns your prayer off while you're doing it, you either have to click your prayers and a tile on the same tick, or you need to make sure that you're clicking at least 3 squares away so that your character is going to run for long enough for you to switch over your prayers. If worse comes to worse, don't forget that you do have your redemption prayer. If you do have some weak armor on, then the max hit that you can take through prayer is more than 10, which means redemption is not guaranteed to save you. But if you do run out of food, you can turn on your redemption prayer between when the Hunllef attacks and when the attack actually hits you. You do need to time this so that you can still use your protection prayer right when the Hunllef is attacking. That way it still lowers the damage that it does to you. But then be using your redemption prayer when you're taking the damage so that it has a chance to heal you up. You do have very little time after using redemption to sip a prayer potion, get those prayer points back, and turn your prayer back on. So overall, using redemption in this fight successfully can be pretty difficult, but it also can be a lifesaver. Remember that I brought up the 5-to-1 method before. This method can be used with a halberd to attempt a little bit faster kill, since the halberd does have a higher max hit when it is on the aggressive attack style. A faster kill means that you're taking less attacks from the Hunllef, so you're going to need less food and possibly weaker armor to get through the fight. 5-to-1 requires a bit more effort since you have to keep count of your own attacks too, but it does make for a little bit of a faster boss kill. Those are the main things that I either had to focus on myself or they just helped me out in the process of learning to kill the Hunllef. You may not be having the exact same problems that I had during the fight though, and if you need more example kills, remember that I will be putting out some Hour of Gauntlet videos in the next couple of days after this guide, and they will be linked in the description. If you do have any specific questions here on what you should be doing, what you might be doing wrong, just anything about the Hunllef fight, do leave them in the comments section below, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. Now we can go ahead and get into the best part of the guide, the loot. The Gauntlet has a very solid and pretty simple loot table. There's a lot of rune items, uncut gems, battle staves, arrows, and even runes on the normal table. If you complete the regular Gauntlet, you get 2 rolls on that normal table, and if you complete the Corrupted Gauntlet, you get 3 rolls on that normal loot table, which adds up to some pretty solid bonus loot. If you die in either version of the Gauntlet, you do get some loot, but it's going to be something weak, like some cake, or a mithril item, or even a simple flyer or potion. If you successfully complete the Gauntlet, you'll also get some crystal shards, 3 to 7 shards for a normal Gauntlet run, and 4 to 9 shards for the Corrupted Gauntlet. These shards can turn into an extra like 10k GP per shard. If you had 97 Herblore and we were able to make divine super combat potions out of them, they can also be used for charging many other things and in general making divine potions for yourself. So not everybody's going for crystal shards for the profit, but they do add a little bit of profit. As for the uniques from the fight, we first have the Crystal Weapon and the Crystal Armor Seed. Each of these seeds do have their own separate role, which means you can get one of each seed in one kill. The Armor Seed's a little bit more sought after and a lot more expensive, but they each have the same drop rate. For a regular Gauntlet kill, it is a 1 in 120 chance for the seeds, but for the Corrupted Gauntlet, you have a 1 in 50 chance for the seeds. These odds are not affected by that extra roll on the Corrupted Gauntlet, as the extra roll only affects your regular loot, not uniques. The Blade of Seldor is the most sought after drop on the Gauntlet. The Blade is one of the most powerful weapons in the game, and at the time of this video, it is worth just over 100 mil. From the regular Gauntlet, you only have a 1 in 2,000 chance for getting a Blade, but for the Corrupted Gauntlet, you've got a nice 1 in 400 rate, which isn't that bad overall. The blade being as expensive as it is makes up for a very large chunk of the money that you're going to be making here, which means when it comes to GP per hour, you're mostly going to be seeing those below average hours and then occasionally making a ton of money. Really good players can manage over 3 mil an hour if they never die from the Hunllef boss and they're having each of their runs take under 10 minutes on that Corrupted Gauntlet. This is pretty difficult to do, and overall I would say more like 2 mil an hour is going to be your fast pace, and closer to 1 mil an hour if you're still on a learning pace, you're getting KO'd a lot. And then if you go down to only regular Gauntlet kills, you're never doing the Corrupted Gauntlet, you're barely going to be breaking that 1 mil an hour, and that's after getting your blade drop every 2,000 kills or so. You can also get the Hunllef pet from the Gauntlet, which is one of the cooler looking pets in the game. This pet is a 1 in 2,000 drop from the regular Gauntlet, and then a 1 in 800 drop from the Corrupted Gauntlet, which is interesting because both the blade and the pet are 1 in 2,000 from regular, but then when you get to Corrupted Gauntlet, you get a 1 in 400 for the blade, but a 1 in 800 for the pet. I believe this is everything that I wanted to talk about when it comes to the Gauntlet, everybody. There is a lot to the Gauntlet overall, so this has been a little bit longer than my average guide, but I hope it is all the information that you needed. If you enjoyed the video or you just got some of that useful information out of it, be sure to like and subscribe for more content. I do stream on Twitch, which the links are on the screen and in the description. I'm on Twitter. I have a Discord, which again, those links are in the description. If you have any questions about the Gauntlet, be sure to ask them in the comments section below so I can get back to you as soon as possible. Again, the Gauntlet can be remotely complicated, so there's not a 100% chance that I answered every question you have here. Also, again, I will be making those Hour of Gauntlet videos that might help with some example kills and answering some more questions. Thank you very much for watching my Gauntlet guide, everybody, and best of luck with your Gauntlet grind.